Hello there, and welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice in this little mini custom podcast that everyone can enjoy. This month, Lordrusty has chosen Co-op Buildcraft Excellence. Lordrusty says, I'd like to expand on a topic we discussed during one of your Genshin Impact streams. What makes a good co-op buildcraft game? I'd like to start by defining my terms, then talking about some games which I feel did and did not succeed at good co-op buildcraft, and then finish by asking what you think about this definition, and if you have any games you'd like to talk about, either because they did or did not succeed. Cool. I consider good co-op buildcraft, Rusty says, to be a quality separate from whether a game has good co-op gameplay or good buildcraft. It's a quality specifically about how well a game succeeds at encouraging you to think about your team when making builds or work with a team to make a build together. I posit that the best way to achieve this is by having a system which can quickly communicate build decisions to every member of the team, a game format which encourages build cooperation, and enough meaningful interactions in both the build phase and gameplay phases of the games for these co-op build choices to matter. Okay, so this parlay, you've provided a lot of really good, pretty short individually examples. That's awesome. So I'm going to structure it by reading one example. There's quite a bit more, so I'll read one of them, and then I'll respond to that, read the next one, respond to that. We'll go through it like that, because this is already pretty well structured. Awesome. So first I want to talk about this definition. I actually think that recently, as I've been working on a video about buildcraft videos being kind of inherently bad in some way, I've recently been thinking that co-op buildcraft is almost inversely proportional to the game's buildcraft in some way. Or there's something about making a game have good buildcraft that makes co-op buildcraft elusive. You know, it's like almost like the things that you would do to make a game have good buildcraft do something that makes it hard to make the game have good co-op buildcraft. And I'm going to explain what I think that thing is, and we'll come back to it as we go through these examples. I think that's a better way, if you don't mind me taking some artistic license here, to explain what I think about the examples, rather than giving you my thesis at the very end. I'll give it to you here, and we'll talk about yours and mine with each example. Okay, so let me explain. I think that when a game has good buildcraft, in short, basically that means that the game has meaningful choices to make. You can change options in the game, and you're not spending a lot of time faffing about to make very little difference. The game changes either your success or failure, and or like your playstyle when you make decisions. Those decisions are in some way interesting. Maybe there's like a lot of them that are still meaningful, or there's very few and they're meaningful in a really complicated way that responds to each other. Maybe the game has a lot of interlocking decisions. Maybe there's an interesting way in which the game rewards a lot of synergy, but then also rewards non-synergy in a different way, etc., etc., etc. Maybe the very way you make the build is itself kind of a build or a buildcraft experience, a series of deliberate choices towards some end. Now, for games to have all that stuff, you need a relatively open-ended game. This is where the problem starts to arise, in my opinion. If you have a relatively open-ended game, then a variety of builds will do. There will be various benefits and detriments to a build being good. I think that another hallmark of good buildcraft is the existence of niche and generalist builds. I think that's something that tends to be true when a game has good buildcraft. It should be possible for a build to be like better in some areas at the expense of being good in other areas, and for builds to be good everywhere, but they shouldn't be as good as some more specialized builds, or there would be no point in making any other builds. That might not always be true. You might do a game where the generalists rule, but there's a lot of different kinds of generalists, whatever. But anyway, and the problem with all of this is that when you have a game where the balance is going to be a little bit looser, therefore allowing for a lot of different build options without impossibly good game balancing, and you've got a lot of different contexts in which to make builds useful, and you've got a relatively larger number of choices that actually matter, you're exponentially increasing the amount of, I guess, like variance in a group while keeping the risk, I guess, or like how much it matters exactly what someone is using, relatively lower. This means that if you do what Lordrusty said, I'm going to read it again, that a good way to achieve good co-op buildcraft is to have a system that can quickly communicate build decisions, and then a game format which encourages build cooperation and enough meaningful interactions in the build phase, gameplay phase, for those co-op build choices to matter. If you have that, I would argue that that tight type of balancing where it would matter that you synergize in a party is kind of exactly what most buildcraft games don't have. They specifically avoid having that thing because it allows for a lot of build options to exist in the space. For a game to reward co-op buildcraft, to say it differently, you would need to have a game where the synergies you got out of cooperating with a party were powerful enough to matter, and that's across like usually 2 or 4 people. It's often 4 people, 3 people, which means there's no way that an individual player's choices are going to be sufficient on their own if it matters that synergizing in a group is effective, basically. I said that in a confusing way. If synergizing with your group matters, that's going to have to provide a big enough benefit that I almost feel like individual buildcraft will necessarily cease to exist. And the problem with this is that means if you don't synergize with your group, if you don't work together, you're asking for a level of teamwork that doesn't occur in public queue, which makes the game essentially unplayable. And I think that's why, in my opinion, there are practically no good co-op buildcraft games. I have very rarely experienced like a good co-op buildcraft experience. And now, not to be all doom and gloom, before we get into these examples, I think the key is that the game should avoid success and failure. Having you win more rather than win at all is a good way to resolve the tension. Secondary objectives and the desire to get more resources and or finish a mission quicker, these are things that are good ways to resolve that tension. Making a game where you can play what you want, the balance doesn't need to be too precise, and yet synergizing with your team to become far more than the sum of your parts doesn't like snap the game in half like a twig. You can maybe change the difficulty. That's another good thing that a lot of the games in your example list actually already do. And I agree that many of them do have like relatively good co-op buildcraft. So I'm not trying to say that practically no games have any good co-op buildcraft. I kind of said that. But what I mean is that I think this is a rare thing because there's something about buildcraft itself that makes it challenging. I hope that kind of makes sense. Hopefully with some examples, it'll make more sense. Okay, the first example, you said the jumping off point for this was your belief that Genshin Impact has all the right ingredients for co-op buildcraft, but lacks meaningful content. Character picks in Genshin Impact are visible to everyone on the team during team select, and communicating a build, and there is chat in Genshin Impact, would be pretty simple. You could sum it up character, weapon, artifact. I think the lack of culture and content around co-op hold Genshin Impact back from hitting its ceiling for co-op buildcraft, though. Yes, so Genshin Impact is a good example for a lot of reasons. A lot of which I think are probably separate topics in themselves. One of them is that Genshin Impact's buildcraft changes when you're in a group. It doesn't mean the same thing to build a character if you're planning to be in co-op versus not. The short version, if you haven't played Genshin Impact, is that this is a game where you control a team of 4 characters. They swap in and out of the field, one of them on the field at a time. And they can often buff themselves, and that buff will stay when you swap off them. So you can kind of funnel power into one attacker on your team from your other 3 characters that are supporting them, or swap attackers if one of them has a cooldown you want to work around or something. But when you play co-op, instead, all 4 people have 1 character on the field, 4 at the same time, but you don't have a team to swap through. Your team has been expanded to be operated by the other 3 players, kind of, and they each pick 1 character for that team. This means that characters that are greedy with their field time suddenly become really good, where before they would have had a big drawback, like you wouldn't have been swapping your other characters as much. A character that heals a lot but has terrible energy generation, like Barbara, is suddenly much more powerful in a co-op situation because you're going to get such a ridiculous amount of elemental energy from your 3 teammates that are on the field all the time. And you also have 3 targets to heal all the time. This means that it's a lot more valuable to be, standing there healing constantly. I reckon Barbara's actually pretty good in a co-op situation. You can also pop off with Ocean Hued Clam because you'll get all that healing, so you turn it into damage. But in normal gameplay, I would argue that Barbara is the least good character in Genshin Impact at the moment. That's an extreme example, but it's not the only example. There are definitely other types of attackers that have more or less uptime, or they don't rely on other party support to enable them in some way. Again, really energy hungry characters, etc. And so playing co-op does change Genshin Impact a lot. I don't think that's good or bad necessarily, but it is interesting to note in light of what I said at the top of the video. If there's something about buildcraft systems that makes it difficult to make them work in co-op, one very complicated solution could possibly be to make a game where the context of the build things changes when you're in a group. In Genshin Impact, another thing you could look to is the elemental reaction system. If you get a lot of your damage by reacting Hydro and Pyro to make Vaporize, which is a damage multiplier, but then you're in co-op and you literally cannot do that by yourself because you have one character with one vision that's one element, then that does change the co-op situation a lot. You've taken away some power from the player, but potentially you're giving it back and a little bit more if your teammates help out. This might be a good way to modulate the power level of group synergy. It certainly matters, and you might be able to succeed without it. But Genshin Impact is also, like I was saying before, a game that is not really about succeeding. At an appropriate level, you will succeed at a domain or a Spiral Abyss or whatever. Genshin Impact is much more about succeeding faster or more decisively or more consistently. The consequences for failure are literally just time, but what is the consequence for failure in any game, really, And so I think Genshin Impact does actually hit a lot of good marks there. There is a problem, though. I think Genshin Impact scores poorly on, so you said the lack of culture and content around co-op. Yeah, like the challenges available. There's nothing that really warrants the power increase of coordinating with other players. But the other thing is that if they were to add that, and then you wanted to coordinate with your team, you'd want them to have a thing that showed what artifact set and weapons people had. But Genshin Impact is a game with a very strong, very oversimplified social community. In fact, I've argued in previous parlays that this too is something that buildcraft inherently causes. Buildcraft communities usually oversimplify the game and don't fully understand its nuance, which means that there's usually a pretty toxic culture of you're not using the right things, even though those players are usually either literally wrong or they just don't know, really. They're paranoid about it not being the normal thing because they're worried about their time being wasted. So when they see something they're not familiar with, they immediately discard it as ineffective. And I'm not really sure what a good solution to that would be. It would be interesting to allow players to kind of demonstrate their build before you got into the group, like having a lobby where there are training dummies and you literally see a player's DPS meter for how much damage output they're doing, maybe. Some games might be able to solve it that way. Then your skepticism that an unknown build is okay and is not going to waste your time is alleviated because you literally see it doing good damage. I think that would work on all except the most unreasonable people. And you can't please everyone. Like, some people are just going to make an ass of themselves, right? But I do think that's a real problem. It's not enough to say, oh, but people are just rude. Like, this is the internet. You can't get rid of that. It's far beyond being a limited problem that way. You legitimately should get to know if your party members are taking the piss out of the co-op experience. So I think Genshin Impact has a complicated situation. I don't think Genshin Impact is really trying to be a game that involves that level of coordination in a group. I think it's using co-op as a kind of a crutch, I guess you would say. But I think it's an interesting one to bring up because I feel like from a development perspective, you wouldn't need to do very much to make Genshin Impact have really good co-op buildcraft. And I also think, finally, so many things about Genshin Impact. I hope that's okay. This is a good example because it strikes home your point about, you said, I consider good co-op buildcraft to be a quality separate from whether a game has good co-op gameplay or good buildcraft. I think Genshin Impact has good buildcraft and bad co-op gameplay. And making Genshin Impact have good co-op buildcraft would not make it have good co-op gameplay, in my opinion. Genshin Impact really isn't designed for co-op, I would argue. It's kind of just something they added. It's a clumsy implementation. A lot of the game's main events don't really work in co-op. It's not really a game that involves that coherently. It's a thing you can do. It's not like garbage or anything. I'm sure there's some people enjoying it and they're thinking, but that's not my experience. I'm not telling you you didn't have fun with it. I'm just saying I feel like it's not a very complete part of the game. It doesn't feel like they made things in the game that are focused on there being co-op. It's just kind of something that's also there. And yet again, it's like surprisingly interesting from a buildcraft perspective. So it would be cool if they integrated it more, but that would not make the game have good co-op gameplay overall. I think that's a great example of that point you made. A very long example that I hope was like, okay, interesting as a place to start. The rest of them are going to be shorter. Really good examples though. Deep Rock Galactic is a game which Rusty feels should have great co-op buildcraft. It's got great co-op mechanics and a pretty robust build system, but the fact that you can't see what equipment your team is bringing while on the space rig is a big downside unless you're playing with friends over voice chat. Yes, I think that this is a good example of a game that it really would be as simple as just showing people what your build is while you're in the space rig. And I think Deep Rock Galactic sidesteps the build efficacy issue that Genshin Impact might have, because one, the game has an unusually positive community. I don't think the Deep Rock Galactic community would be worried about like what people were bringing. And two, I actually don't think Deep Rock Galactic, Genshin Impact, Deep Rock Galactic has particularly meaningful buildcraft. On a high level, there are definitely different play styles you can pick. But for the most part, I would say like if you're picking a certain weapon, there are a lot of different nodes you can pick, but much of the time there's the choice becomes obvious once we know what like hop up you're using. You know, the overdrive, overclocks, that's what they're called in Deep Rock Galactic. For people who haven't seen this game, I'll briefly explain. In Deep Rock Galactic, a weapon has, let's say like 7-ish different kind of talent tree points. So often this will be a choice between 2, usually 3, and sometimes 4 options, and you can pick them. It might be like reloading faster versus magazine capacity, or damage in this situation versus damage in that situation versus ammo maximum carried. So you're kind of changing how much total damage you're carrying in reserve. In Deep Rock Galactic, ammo maximum is actually pretty relevant. Like it's important. So increasing how much damage your stock of bullets is worth, but in different ways, or like just giving you more bullets, is meaningful. I'm not saying they're not meaningful choices, but they are very simple choices. And the key is that you also get an overclock at the bottom. These are late game upgrades, but they're what you have if you're, making a meaningfully different build usually. And they often change the weapon's behavior a lot. I'll give you a simple example. They've got a weapon that's like you fire a plasma pulse. It's got infinite punch through, you fire a wave, it punches through enemies, good damage, like an energy shotgun, I guess. There's an overclock for it that instead of making it go whoom, it makes it spin. You fire kind of like a fidget spinner tripwire thing. It doesn't really move as far, but it lasts longer and spins in place like a saw blade kind of energy. If you pick that, this might not specifically be a good example, Deep Rock Galactic people, but just bear with me. Once you've picked that overclock, it often becomes a lot less of a meaningful decision which of those nodes on the talent tree you pick. A lot of the time, once you've specified the weapon's functionality like that, it becomes a foregone conclusion which of the upgrades at certain points is literally just better. Sometimes even down to just math. 2 of them are going to both make it do more damage over time, but one of them literally just does more damage when you've picked this overclock, which is not meaningful choices, which are not meaningful choices, which is not grammar. So I don't think that Deep Rock Galactic has particularly meaningful buildcraft in so much as like there are complicatedly different builds. You could give someone the build details of your Deep Rock Galactic loadout, but very few of those details actually matter. What you really need to know is like they're using this weapon with this overclock for the most part. That's not always true. There definitely are. It's not that simple. I'm just saying I do think this is a game that kind of like your example before, if good co-op buildcraft is separate from good co-op gameplay and good buildcraft, I think Deep Rock Galactic has good co-op gameplay and not bad buildcraft, but not really that much buildcraft. Co-op, however, okay, yeah, no, I do think that's a thing. I think that there's a degree to which like point defense, like having a bunch of engineer players, might just be sort of unnecessary. Like you'll have enough turrets and everything will just die. Or the one time an AOE hits the turret nest, they're all gonna die and it's bad. You would want to kind of divide it up. Now, I think Deep Rock Galactic is kind of designed such that it doesn't really matter exactly what weapons people bring. The general functionality of the weapon is relatively intact between different positions. Like if you have an engineer on your team, like they will broadly do the turret thing, you know. But it's not like it doesn't matter which. Like there is something to be gained by synergizing that way. So if you showed people the broad strokes of someone's build, and you maybe didn't include the individual like talent nodes, you showed weapons and overclocks, in other words, combined with the good communication and good community of Deep Rock Galactic, that might work. That's an interesting thought, and I think the result would be buildcraft decisions that matter in the context of co-op. As an example, the engineer can make 2 turrets or 1 more concentrated turret. I'm obviously greatly oversimplifying, but it's just an example. If you had a group of 4 people that were trying to synergize together, you would often be more willing to have 1 more powerful turret or like more ammo efficiency on your turret. That's fairly important. If you had multiple of them, 2 engineers running those beefier turrets, this is just an example, but that could be interesting in a way that you wouldn't want to do that so much if you were solo, because you can only place literally 1 turret in 1 place. What if you want to defend multiple places? It might be a more reasonable decision if you had 2 people who you knew were doing that at a glance. You see what I'm trying to say? So that's an interesting point. I do think what I'm getting at is there's some buildcraft in Deep Rock Galactic that wakes up if you're in co-op in a way that I think it sort of doesn't as much if you're solo. There's just a bunch of different ways to get the job done that all sort of work. It reminds me a lot of our next example in that way, Warframe. But quickly, I'd like to give another kind of parallel example. Apex Legends is a game that literally has 0 buildcraft individually. You have the weapons you have. You get what you drop on, you know? And for your character, they have abilities, but you cannot select any settings about those things. If you pick Wraith, you are Wraith. You cannot change anything about how those abilities work. Interestingly, on the mobile version, you can, but that's a topic for another time. Anyway, so obviously there are some like, what loot do I choose over other loot? But I would say it's largely preference. Like people who play Apex Legends, you mostly get what you get. And then once you are choosing, like I want this gun over that gun, you're either going to pick based on which one has better upgrades or which one you're more comfortable with. You're not going to choose based on like its synergy with your legend beyond what you're already choosing for like which one you prefer. You might pick a sniper with your sniper focused legend. Sure, but I don't feel like that's a meaningful choice. That's like that type of weapon is just literally better on that character. It's not like to say they synergize is like saying that the character can only use that type of weapon. I don't know. I don't think that's really meaningful buildcraft. However, the team composition you pick in Apex Legends is very meaningful buildcraft. You can do some pretty interesting stuff comboing different characters' abilities together, like Newcastle, who can jump to an ally's location and make a big fortress around them. This is also a moderately powerful movement ability, but you need a target to do it really quickly in the middle of a fight. Sometimes it might be very challenging, awkward, even impossible to get line of sight on a roof if you're like in the middle of a skirmish. But if you have your ally up there, their Valkyrie, who can just fly up there, Pathfinder, who can just grapple up there, whatever, you could extremely quickly whoop right back up there and get them. Newcastle can also drag people around when they're downed and put up his knockdown shield to defend them, something that you can potentially use as a way to give yourself cover in the middle of a fight. If your ally crawls into an advantageous position, you might have allies who are more focused on restoring defenses so that you can kind of bunker up. So it's meaningful to be behind that wall. You can actually gain something being there, like maybe Watson with her ultimate. She puts down a thing that regenerates shields nearby, and it also eats grenades and stuff, which is something that Newcastle and, for example, like Rampart with her walls she can put up, kind of a mini version with an offensive buff when you shoot through them. Those characters really appreciate Watson destroying like grenades and stuff that come in a way that other characters would care a lot less about. Like, it's fine, we can just move. None of my abilities are on the ground, as per se. Again, this is a somewhat oversimplified example, just to say that there are definitely meaningful synergies between legends in the game, but if you're playing solo, that's essentially just not a part of the game. I don't think Deep Rock Galactic is quite like that, but I do think it's an interesting example to compare to. Warframe fails, you say, for another reason. The game has plenty of build options, they're all visible to the entire team, sort of, while aboard the Orbiter, and the culture of the game is 4-player co-op as standard, but there's just not enough interaction between frames to merit considering your teammate's build. Most frames are made to be self-sufficient, while you can find neat synergies between frames, it's rarely worth communicating about them. Warframe is a fantastic and pretty simple example of what I mentioned at the top of the video. I think Warframe doesn't have meaningful co-op buildcraft for two main reasons. The first one is what you mentioned. Frames are simply designed to be pretty self-sufficient. You could make a version of Warframe where this was less of a thing. Most frames in Warframe have an ability that is vaguely a survivability solution, or they have those stats innately. And most frames also have some kind of damage buffing or kill the enemies better ability, and some kind of throughout crowd control ability. There are a few frames that are less balanced that way, but because of the helmet system, it's not like you can't add an ability in a category you're missing if you want one. If more frames were designed without, like, checking each of those boxes, the helmet system would still allow you to check those boxes if you wanted to, but there would be a lot more of a benefit to having a teammate that checked that box. For example, a damage buff. If you were playing a character that was really tanky but lacked a damage buff, and a teammate provided 2 damage buffs, that would be much more powerful in a world where less frames already did that, is what I'm trying to say. But because of the helmet system, you would preserve the ability to do it yourself if you wanted to. That would just be something you would gain. You could just pick another helmet ability if your teammate was doing that. So there would be that potential opportunity for group synergy. Now, I think the second thing, though, it wouldn't really change. You know, you could change that part of the game's design, but Warframe is still a game that isn't balanced in a way where objectives are difficult enough or combat is at a pace where it would be meaningful to synergize with people. Even if you could, you kind of just wouldn't a lot of the time. Especially the movement in Warframe makes it very difficult to make any ability affect allied Warframes in a way that is actually good, unless it just affects them no matter what, which I would argue kind of dims the feeling that you're actually interacting with other people. Trinity, for example, Harrow, they have very powerful group supportive abilities, and they are very good, useful Warframes. People support their team technically all the time, but they've been made to be broad, which is why they are good. Like, they wouldn't be good if they were more specific, because you wouldn't be affecting people or they wouldn't benefit from the buff. But because the things they give are so open-ended and affect in affinity range, you just kind of do benefit your teammates. And indeed, Harrow's other abilities that don't work in affinity range much less frequently benefit your team, even though they're theoretically very powerful. They simply might not need energy, etc. There's just so little punishment in Warframe's build system for checking all the boxes, and the game is so bouncing off the walls. Like, being versatile, being self-sufficient is reliable because the game rewards building that way, but it's also valuable because the game is played in a way where you want something that just works. Because it's a game that is fast and you bounce all over the map, it's more valuable in a game with gameplay like that to have a build that you don't need any other input from. Think about the Sahasa Kubro, which digs up a bunch of ammo and energy and stuff. It gives you a ton of resources, but it only works when you're standing still and not fighting, which just never happens in Warframe. So it's occasionally really useful, but generally not that powerful. You'd think that would be overbearingly overpowered, but that simple condition in a game like Warframe makes all the difference. And I think that's similar to the co-op thing in Warframe. I hope that example makes sense. I don't think that making the game have frames that are less self-sufficient would on its own make Warframe have any meaningful co-op buildcraft. I think to do that, you would need a game where the pace of the game or the timbre of the game was different. I'd also say that among games where it's about succeeding better or faster, Warframe is a game where even for that, it's kind of just too easy at a lot of levels of play, and it's much more meaningful to just have more bodies. I think that having enemies that are truly much more tanky, or which you kind of occupy a bullet shield, like they deflect all fire from the front, but then you could shoot them from another side, would make having a teammate much more valuable. Whereas at the moment, it's like if you do enough damage, there really isn't any reason you would need other teammates, provided you can just make the enemies that you're not fighting shut up while you kill this enemy, which you really can. Like, there's very good crowd control in Warframe. You are a one-man army in Warframe, and the fantasy of the game, in some way you could say, kind of denies meaningful co-op buildcraft. The whole point of the game's fantasy, in some way, is that you do not need help. Is that you are doing this David and Goliath thing. So I would argue that the problem is deeper baked into Warframe's mechanics, gameplay loop, and also kind of the vibe the game gives off. It's not just because you simply don't really need to check those boxes with your teammates' benefit. There's a bigger, deeper conflict in Warframe than that. You say, I'd also like to point out that there are some games like Team Fortress 2, Titanfall 2, anyway, surrounding co-op buildcraft, but don't actually have any to a meaningful build degree. Team Fortress 2 has team select screens and individual character builds, with a few exceptions. Demo Night, it's Team Fortress 2, comes to mind. None of the build options significantly change the character, and the best team comp is always a blend of all the classes. I don't know anything about Team Fortress 2, so I can't comment further, but I do think it's an interesting point that kind of the opposite of Warframe, you might get a game that seems to have the trappings of a co-op build game, but when you look under the hood, it just doesn't actually matter, like in practice. I think that's an interesting point. Again, I think it's key to think about the social aspect for things like this. Does the game maybe benefit from feeling like you're contributing to the team, but it like doesn't really matter that much what you pick? Maybe that's good. It just isn't meaningful buildcraft, but that might not be bad, Rusty, you say, for all of League of Legends' problems, oh boy, I think it actually scores high points on the co-op buildcraft test. Team select is a big part of making a strategy, and all players can see others' choices, and then in-game item choices are visible to all players. Making your build choices based around both your team and your opponent's choices is key to victory. I think League of Legends is a really good example. I think essentially everything else about League of Legends is bad, but if you wanted to say that it had good team buildcraft, I would say yeah, and even further, it's pretty good at you responding to your opponent. I would say that it's up there with Magic the Gathering for like sideboard choices being, I would almost argue, kind of the crux of competitive play. Metagame and sideboard choices. And in League of Legends, that is very true as well. Knowing based on what your opponent's team is and maybe what they're building, they've got armor pen. I haven't played League of Legends in so long, but I played a lot of it, so forgive these janky examples. They have a certain type of crowd control, or they're building Shirelia's Reverie, so they're all really fast, or they have a way to dispel your movement speed debuffs, so you kind of go for a different approach, or whatever. If you played League of Legends, I'm sure these are obvious to you, but yeah, there are like just the right level of complexity interactions you can make that way. And because an item build in League of Legends is on the surface straightforward, but then if you change one item, what else might be good kind of changes around that. I don't know because I don't follow League of Legends professionally at all, but I would predict that those decisions are actually pretty interesting at the very few levels of play that people actually make them, is what I'm getting at. The problem with League of Legends has always been in part that the complex things about the game don't actually exist at the level that most people play. They're just things that theoretically exist in the game if you're a person that plays it a ton. But I have known someone who played it a ton, and it sure sounded very interesting. And having played it myself and attempted and failed to do those things, I really hate League of Legends. I think you're totally right. I think that League of Legends has a really good way of you interacting with your team. And it's not as simple as like just bot lane. You know, you've got your attacking character and a supportive character. Um, it's also like exactly which characters those are having abilities that might combo together. Another like really simple, kind of janky example is Yasuo. He's got a really powerful move that you can only use when enemies are airborne. He does have a way to get enemies airborne himself, but it's pretty valuable if you have other ways in your team. So I would argue that that's like another meaningful knob to turn. There's so many characters in League of Legends, I feel like that kind of dims that a bit, but it narrows down a lot if you know you have this, you know, AD carry and this support, and then you have Yasuo, and it's like, all right, well, based on that composition, I now want, I guess I want an ability power character that has a knock-up ability that can go top or jungle. That narrows it down quite a bit, right? I mean, I don't know if it does, but I'm sure it does. I don't know. That I think that's a great example. Okay, the last example you have is Mass Effect 3's multiplayer. I have not played that, which I think is the perfect co-op buildcraft game. Uh-oh. For those who haven't played it, the format was a short 10-wave horde shooter taking roughly 20 minutes. While there's some personal buildcraft, a big part of finding success in that game was picking which character from your roster meshed well with other players' choices, then spending 20 minutes figuring out if you were right. That's well worded. All build choices were visible during character select, and synergies made a big difference during actual gameplay. Rusty concludes, so after this long list of examples, what are your thoughts on what makes a good or bad co-op buildcraft experience? Are tabletop role-playing games a good co-op buildcraft experience? Yes, and I'll talk about why I think that. Do you recommend any games to look at as examples of good or bad co-op buildcraft? Okay, about the Mass Effect 3 multiplayer, I know literally zero about this, so I can't comment too much. But I want to note that as we've gone through these examples, do you kind of see what I mean about, like, it does seem true that games that have the standout team buildcraft, it's not particularly interesting personal buildcraft, and vice versa. Or they do the Genshin Impact thing where, like, they're theoretically both meaningful, but they're just completely different. Like, there's really no similarities between the team buildcraft and the personal buildcraft. I really do think that there's something about the nature of good solo buildcraft that makes for bad team buildcraft or no team buildcraft, and vice versa. And again, I think it's good to say, throughout this, I should have premised this whole parlay by saying, whenever I really said bad or like not good, most of the time it just means like non-existent, not like actively bad, you know? Generally, these games just don't have that quality. It's not that they have like buildcraft, but it's atrocious, you know. They either have it or they sort of don't. Like, I think Deep Rock Galactic's options are really good. I don't think they're meaningful personal buildcraft, but they're not bad personal buildcraft, I don't think. They're just not personal buildcraft. That's what I think. They do, you know, there's kind of an open question about whether customizing the handling of your weapon. Do you want magazine size or reload speed when one of them isn't obviously better, which it often is in Deep Rock Galactic, in my opinion. But let's say there's a situation where it isn't obviously that one's better or the other. Being able to just pick which you would prefer as a player is a good thing that I think should probably be considered to be buildcraft. Again, this is helpful to the degree that this term applies to real people, you know. I guess for most people that want a build, they want to make a build, they want to customize their choice and have it like matter and give them the benefit they want. I guess customizing handling is that, you know. So it would be wrong to say that that's not, it's not useful to say that isn't buildcraft, I guess. Right. So I do strongly feel that there is something that I wish I could explain better, but basically is like balancing that makes it so buildcraft, which is often synergy or like choices being more than the sum of their parts, is hard to get right if it's going to be solo and co-op. Basically because the power increase that you get from co-op synergy, if it's meaningful, it's therefore too much for solo buildcraft to still kind of work. And I think a lot of games, sort of knowing this, either mute both of them, they make it so the impact of synergy is limited in general, or they don't have one of the two, or again, the game completely changes. There are lots of games that we didn't talk about that I can't come to my mind because I don't remember them anymore, that have really bad co-op buildcraft or bad solo buildcraft. And the reason is that the game isn't balanced, accounting for that synergy bump. So when you do have an ally and you synergize with them, the game hasn't done anything to mitigate that power spike, and the game is ludicrously easy as soon as you do that, or it's unacceptably hard when you don't do that. That's another example. Personally, so far, I've found Path of Exile to be like this. I'm not all the way through it. Please don't take that to heart too much. Just an example of a game that, certainly in the mid levels, it's hilariously easy to do a lot of things when you're playing with a partner, but doing them solo is, harder. Not, I don't know about hard, but the difficulty feels kind of right to me at that point. Um, Whereas when you have an ally, it doesn't feel like it matters what you're doing, which I really don't think the game called to that level of synergy you get. I don't even think you really need synergy. It's just the force multiplier of multiple people. Anyway, um, something we didn't really talk about that much, but it does apply to a lot of these games. Warframe is a good example, is the idea that simply having another entity in the environment with you for enemies to target is a pretty big bump in effectiveness in most of these games. And even if you had 3 allies that were as survivable as you but did no damage, you would gain 90% of the benefit of having fully functioning allies. Again, I think Warframe is a good example. If you don't like playing on co-op or you're doing the steel path, you know what you should do? Deploy specters, or use Warframes that summon units. Having more things that the enemies can shoot is a surprisingly large amount of the benefit of being in a team, which I'm not sure that's good or bad, but is true in a lot of these games. I think Deep Rock Galactic is an example of a game that gets the balance better. They do increase the amount of enemies that spawn in a way that matters a lot more than in Warframe, because AoE is so powerful in Warframe, I guess. So in Deep Rock Galactic, the damage your teammates are doing, it feels a lot more meaningful. You really need that damage output. Those bullets, really. I think ammo economy is a great thing that Deep Rock Galactic does that I personally played very few games that I feel like get right. It matters a lot. When you build a weapon in Deep Rock Galactic, you don't want to build the weapon usually to have very bad ammo economy. That's a big problem in that game. They did a good job making it not fatal. You get a lot of damage if you drop your ammo economy out the window, but it matters. And so synergizing with your team to manage that ammo stuff, maybe even having a teammate who does more burst damage but has bad ammo economy, and funneling the ammo to them that you share, while you build a character that has more sustained ammo economy but doesn't do quite as much damage, might be a good strategy. I did that when I played, and I thought it was reasonably effective. So yeah, I think those things are great examples. I think you gave really good examples, and I have played most of them, thankfully. I think tabletop role-playing games, I've only played D&D, but I think the concept of these games is good for buildcraft because of something that we've discussed previously. Good for co-op buildcraft because the win condition isn't very hard, you might say. It's, if you're playing a good tabletop role-playing game, generally not about just winning or losing, but about how you win or lose, which means that the difficulty is modulated a little, which I said I thought was key. There are a lot of games where because tabletop role-playing games don't often have a set format, or the game master can kind of modulate difficulty. If the party proves to be capable, you can simply make the game respond. They have very good adaptive difficulty potential, which makes it okay if the party synergizes. It feels awesome to be doing combos with your party. Having enemies that are stronger will feel acceptable in response. A lot of players want a good challenge. They want a good fight. So it's not going to feel bad if the game gets a bit harder because the players are fighting a bit harder. I think tabletop RPGs adapt to that very well. Furthermore, I feel like non-combat synergy is practically impossible in games other than tabletop role-playing games, but D&D, anyway, in my experience, is really, really good at inter-party synergy when you're not in combat. Using magic or open-ended abilities to cooperate with an ally, distracting people, or using magic on someone unseen while your party member visibly talks to them so they don't see the effects of the spell or whatever, is very basic but really good. And there's lots of interesting spell combos you can do to make things happen in the world. I feel like these games are a shining example of that. And the trouble is that they do it by basically sidestepping the issue of balance. It's so open-ended that there's really no concern that that will be overpowered. That arguably doesn't exist in the context of a well-functioning tabletop role-playing game of people who are acting in good faith. Now, are most tabletop role-playing games tables that are well-functioning and full of players that are acting in good faith? Like, no, statistically. So this is always my problem with talking about like D&D. Does that really line up with reality, or is that just an experience you could have, I have, but like people don't actually have? I don't really know, you know. To look at Critical Role doing that, and my table, I guess, I think we do a good job of that, and say that that is a thing that occurs feels a little ignorant of like most people playing D&D. But I bet a lot of you have pretty sick tables. I don't know. Do you think tabletop role-playing games are good for buildcraft, group buildcraft? I do. About a year ago now, maybe a little longer, I said that I thought tabletop role-playing games had bad buildcraft because they're defined by being unmarried to their rules, basically. And that is wrong. In fact, I now understand that for the most part, buildcraft benefits from wiggly exact details, broadly speaking. The trick to good buildcraft, you might argue, is having a net to play tennis with, but not being an asshole about exactly how high or tight that net is. And if the ball isn't clearly out or in bounds, to just say, let's go with it. And games that are able to do that balance of like, there is some requirement for success, but it's not extremely stringent and it's a bit more open-ended. I believe that is the key to a game with good buildcraft and good co-op buildcraft. That flexibility is just tested when you try to make a game have good co-op buildcraft as well. And tabletop RPGs are very flexible by their nature, and that makes them successful in this category, I think. Again, I feel like looking through these games, the degree to which they're successful largely dictates whether they have good co-op buildcraft. The other things that matter seem to be mutual information. League of Legends is a good example, and like seeing other players' builds. Good social environment so that that very thing does not become toxic, a problem League of Legends has, Deep Rock Galactic kind of avoids. And finally, having a game where the difficulty isn't so loosey-goosey that synergy is irrelevant or feels unprompted, basically. Warframe has this problem. It's just not... You can actually make teams that are, you know, a lot stronger than the sum of their parts if you wanted to. It's just so blatantly unnecessary that nobody would bother to do that. And if they did, the game would break in other places. It's not really as easy. You need a game that can survive that level of balance, which I don't think Warframe can, which is why it doesn't have it. So that was a really complicated set of 45, 47 minutes of words that I think do a good job encapsulating this really interesting topic. Rusty, I spent a little longer on this one because I feel like you gave awesome examples and I wanted to go through them and be very thorough. So I hope you enjoyed it. I really did. Thank you for this, Parley. It was great. I love having a mix of, like, you see why Parley is fun, right? Some of them, the person just puts up like a janky image about math being fake. And then you turn right back around and the next day somebody does like a excellent dissertation on co-op buildcraft and you're just along for the ride. Like, you see why this is an awesome job to have? Like, it's great. Thank you.